right, so that's who we are. We've been around since, I think, 1992. So now I'd like to introduce our moderators and one presenter. So tonight we have as moderators Tom Hewitt. Tom here. Tom is an opinion editor for Anchorage Daily News, where he's worked since 2018. Born and raised in Fairbanks, Tom was a journalism student at UAF before working as a print reporter and later news editor for TV News in Fairbanks. As well as he's a member of the Alaska Press Club and the Alaska Center for Excellence in Journalism. When not moderating political debates like tonight or writing editorials, he enjoys trail running and canoeing. Our other moderator, we have two moderators. The other moderator is Gunnar Knapp. Gunnar Knapp is Professor Emeritus of Economics at UAA's Institute of Social and Economic Research, ICER. Dr. Knapp worked for ICER for 35 years, studying and teaching about Alaska's economy and resources. 40 years ago, in 1984, Dr. Knapp directed the first study of the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend program. He served as ICER's director from 2014 to 2016. As ICER director and continuing since his retirement in 2016, Dr. Knapp has undertaken extensive analysis of and given numerous presentations on Alaska's fiscal challenges and choices. So lastly, I'll introduce Alexi Painter. Alexi may be going to be here on the screen. If not, you'll see him when he becomes a panelist. Alexi is director of the Alaska Legislative Finance Division in Juneau. He's been the director since 2020. Prior to that, he served as the chief financial analyst of the Office of Management and Budget, a fiscal analyst and capital budget coordinator for the Legislative Finance Division, an economist at the Department of Revenue, and as a legislative aide. So that's Alexi. At this point, Tom is going to introduce our distinguished panelists.
All right, our panelists tonight, we've got here present with us in person Brad Keithley. He's the Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. It's a project focused on developing and advocating for responsible, equitable, durable, and economically robust state fiscal policies. Before starting that project in 2013, he was a partner at the Anchorage office and firm-wide co-head of the oil and gas practice with the Perkins Coie law firm. Before that, he was similarly a partner and co-head of the oil and gas practice with the international law firm of Jones Day. Before joining Jones Day, Mr. Keithley was Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Arkla, Inc., at the time the third largest integrated gas company in the United States. Throughout his legal career, Mr. Keithley largely focused on commercial, regulatory, and financial issues associated with oil and gas development, including its interplay with governmental budgets. With Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets, he has intensified his focus on the Alaska state budget. And joining us via Zoom, we have Angela Rodell. She is the founder and principal of Rodell Consulting, dedicated to providing expert guidance to institutions seeking to improve their overall performance by developing strategies in alignment with their unique goals and values. She also serves as staff to Senator Kathy Giessel, the Alaska Senate Majority Leader, working on major energy policy initiatives. Ms. Rodell is serving as board advisor to the CEO for Pepper, an industry-leading investment enterprise solution for alternative assets, while also serving on several nonprofit boards, including past president of the Pacific Pension and Investment Institute, chair of the board for Launch Alaska, and volunteer member of the investment committee for the Alaska Community Foundation. From 2015 through 2021, Ms. Rodell served as chief executive officer for the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation, a state-owned asset management company responsible for managing the Alaska Permanent Fund. Before becoming CEO, Ms. Rodell served as Alaska's Commissioner of Revenue, responsible for building the state's financial position, securing needed funding for state pension funds, and overhauling the state's oil and gas production tax. From 1996 to 2011, Ms. Rodell served as an investment banker specializing in U.S. municipal finance. Ms. Rodell has a BA from Marquette University and an MPA from the University of Kentucky. And finally, we have Larry Persily, who says he has vacillated between reporting on public policy, writing his opinions on public policy, and trying to make policy during his 48 years in Alaska. During that time, he has focused on oil and gas issues, resource development, taxes, and the state's unsolved fiscal problems with diversions into municipal issues. And among other things, he is the owner of the Wrangell Sentinel newspaper.
Thanks, Tom. So those are our panelists. It's going to be a good discussion tonight. So next, I'll turn it over to Gunnar Knapp, who's going to give a short overview of tonight's program.
Hi, folks. Great to see you here in person, and hello to everybody online. We all know that Alaskans have strongly held and widely divergent views about the Permanent Fund Dividend program. And Alaska Common Ground's purpose in this event is not to argue for any particular future of the dividend program. Rather, in line with our mission to collect and disseminate information and facilitate discussion about Alaska policy issues, our purpose is to help Alaskans understand the history of the dividend program, its budgetary implications, and the wide range of issues that we face relating to the future of the program, and some of the arguments that can be made about these issues. Here's the basic plan for tonight. First, Alexei Painter will be giving us a brief overview of the history of the Permanent Fund and the dividend program. That will be about the first 10 minutes or so. Then, for the bulk of tonight's program, Tom Hewitt and I will moderate a discussion with our three panelists on 6 questions. And I think we have a slide that shows these questions, which will maybe come up. And anyway, I'll go ahead and read or summarize the 6 questions, but we'll come back to them. So question 1 is simply, should there be a PFD? Question 2 is, assuming that there is a PFD, what should be the method for determining the size of the PFD? Sort of how should we calculate what that PFD should be? Third, should a PFD guarantee and formula be in Alaska's Constitution? Should we amend the Constitution to create such a guarantee and formula? Fourth, how should a PFD formula work in years of particularly high or low state revenues? Should the formula, if we have one, should it in some way adjust if up or down if oil revenues are particularly high or low? Fifth, can and should we have both a PFD and broad-based taxes such as an income tax or sales tax at the same time? And 6 is, we'll ask all 3 panelists, is your vision of the PFD something politically feasible that we could actually get to? Is that something that Alaskans could eventually hope to agree on? So we'll, as Brad said, we'll ask these questions in turn of all 3 panelists with a short 2 minutes for them to answer, and then we'll have each question, then we'll have about 4 minutes of follow-up for each question. And so with 6 questions and 10 minutes discussion on each, that'll take about an hour. We hope that will leave us about 15 minutes at the end to take your questions. And so we encourage you to submit them, particularly if they relate to issues that we as moderators or panelists haven't brought up yet. So are we ready to get started? Yeah. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and invite Alexei to go ahead and tell us about the history of the Permanent Fund and the dividend program. Thanks.
All right, thanks, and I will, I do not have the ability to share my screen, but once that pops in, I will share a couple of slides on the history of the Permanent Fund and the dividend program. So the Permanent Fund itself, okay, it looks like I do have the ability to do that. Okay, looks like that's working. Okay, so the Permanent Fund itself was created by a constitutional amendment that was passed by voters back in 1976. And that constitutional amendment says that at least 25% of all mineral lease rentals, royalties, and royalty sale proceeds, I guess I won't read the whole thing, shall be placed in a permanent fund, the principal of which shall be used only for those income-producing investments specifically designated by law as eligible for permanent fund investments. All income from the permanent fund shall be deposited in the general fund unless otherwise provided by law. So essentially, in short, the short version of that is that 25%, at least 25% of what we get from oil and gas and mining royalties go into the permanent fund, and then the Constitution does not speak to what happens with the money. It just says that it goes to the general fund. So by statute, we've set up a little more framework around that. So an additional 25% of mineral lease rentals and royalties for oil fields after 1979 are deposited in the permanent fund principal as well. The legislature has also, by appropriation, added 2.7 billion from the general fund to the principal back in the 1980s. And then the income of the fund, the Constitution says it shall be deposited in the general fund unless provided by law. The statute says that the statutory net income is deposited into what's called the earnings reserve account, which is a fund within the permanent fund that can be spent by the legislature with a majority vote. So inflation proofing can go back from the ERA to the principal by statute, but all that takes an appropriation. So the permanent fund dividend program began in 1982. There had been an earlier statute that was ruled unconstitutional. So the first dividend was paid out in 1982. That's our fiscal year 83 because it was fall, so the beginning of FY 83. First PFD was $1,000 a person. It actually came from the general fund, not the permanent fund. The $1,000 was sort of supposed to be the first 3 dividends because those first 2 didn't go out because they were constitutional litigation. After that, PFDs were based on 50% of the 5-year average of the earnings of the fund. Statutory net income is the term for the realized earnings of the fund. There was an amendment a few years later that changed it from just a straight average to 21% of the 5-year total of the earnings instead of the average. So it's a little more than the average of the earnings against half of the earnings, the average earnings. The remainder of that income remained in the ERA or was transferred to the principal. So through inflation proofing or special appropriations all the way up through FY19, when, as I'll talk about in a couple of slides, the draws from the ERA to fund other things began. So the PFD statute was followed from 1982 until 2016. That year, the governor vetoed the PFD appropriation. All the PFDs had been paid by an appropriation, but those had always just followed the formula up until that year. The governor vetoed that appropriation approximately in half to about $1,000 a person. Since then, the PFD has been set by appropriation and has not followed the statute each year. This next slide shows a history of the permanent fund dividends. The red bars show the actual payments per Alaskan. So you can see that $1,000, then they went down to a few $100s for the next few years. As the fund grew, those grew substantially. Since they're based on earnings, they're a bit volatile. Based on the stock market, we know that there was a great stock market in the late 90s. They rose, and then the crash, they fell again under $1,000. There have been a couple of times when we've supplemented the regular PFD with an energy relief payment, 2008, and then again in 2022. We will likely see that again this year in 2024 for the 3rd time. The dotted lines show for the years when we did not follow the PFD statute, what the statute would have paid. You can see that the statute would have paid a much higher dividend than what the appropriation was and would have been some of the largest dividends in state history. The 2022 payment, including energy relief, was actually the highest total payment in state history, although it was still lower than the statutory payment. So I mentioned earlier that up until FY19, money from the permanent fund did not go to the general fund, it just paid dividends or was retained in the fund. Starting in 2018, the legislature authorized a bill called that generated what's called the percent of market value draw, or POMV draw. In the initial years, that was 5.25% of the 5-year average of the ending fund balance, not including the most recent year. After those first couple of years, that transitioned to 5%, and that's been the amount since then. When that bill passed that established the percent of market value draw, so that goes into the general fund, there was not a change at the time to the PFD statute. We have not followed the PFD statute, but that actually statute remains on the books. The statute with the POMV draw and that PFD statute limits the total draws from the earnings reserve to the general fund and PFDs combined to that POMV calculation. So combined, whatever you take out of the ERA to either PFDs or the general fund can't exceed that. And I've noted that this is in statute. The legislature does not have to follow statutes. We don't have to follow the POMV statute. We don't have to follow the PFD statute because we can break them or we can supersede them through the appropriations process, which is also a law. So in FY25, the upcoming fiscal year, that POMV draw of 3.7 billion is projected to be our largest source of general fund revenue. So the state has become pretty reliant on that draw to solve our fiscal issues. So since the total draws from the permanent fund to the general fund and PFDs are statutorily capped to the POMV amount, that POMV draw of revenue is considered unrestricted revenue. We don't care what unrestricted revenue is spent on. It's all UGF expenditures, whether it's PFDs or other things. Sometimes people say there's a conflict between the POMV statute and the PFD statute. Legally, there's not a conflict. You could pay out the statutory PFD and the POMV draw. There's perhaps a fiscal conflict in that the governor's budget this year, which included a statutory PFD, had approximately a $900 million deficit with that statutory PFD. Of course, that's not to say the only thing you could do is reduce the PFD, which I'm sure the panelists will discuss more. But just that is kind of basically the size of the hole to fill with the statutory PFD, and the governor's budget is about $900 million. And this is my last slide. This shows, since we've been in the POMV era, kind of a history of our revenue and expenditures. The area in the background shows our revenue. The purple is the POMV draw. You can see most years that's been our largest amount. The bars are our budget. And so since we've had the POMV draw, we have had surpluses in 2 years, FY22 and 24, deficits in 4 years, FY19 through 21, and then again 23 and projected in FY25 of the governor's budget. Although the legislature is working on a budget that I think both bodies intend to not have a deficit at the end of the year. So since we've had the POMV draw, we've not been following the PFD statute. We have been following the POMV statute, and we have overall had a roughly balanced budgets or savings accounts. The CBR and SBR have a very similar total balance today as they did when we adopted the POMV draw back in FY19. So that's all I have in terms of slides. I don't know if there's time for questions for me or if that's it, and I'll turn it over to the panel.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks very much, Alexei. And I don't think we'll take questions because we don't have unlimited time, so we want to move along to hear what the panelists have. But we very much appreciate that very helpful introduction. So let's move right into the heart of the matter. Let's see. I think now I'm going to have a series of slides that show the different questions. But our very first question, which I'm going to ask Brad to answer first, followed by Larry and then Angela, is simply, should there be a PFD? By that, and to follow up on that, I mean, what was the original purpose of the PFD? Is that purpose still valid? And what are the basic arguments for your position on the PFD? Brad?
And to stay within the 2 minutes.
Brad, your mic might not be on.
It says it's on. It's 3. Gunnar, take this one back.
We'll just pass them back and forth until one works.
Check.
No. We'll see. You get to start.
Thanks. This one on? We're good. Okay. So, as I said at the beginning, the goal here is not to be cowbelled, so I'm going to keep these short. Absolutely, there should be a PFD. The purpose was described by Governor Hammond to disperse 1/2 of the PFD earnings among Alaska residents. What Hammond said was the purpose behind the permanent fund was to transform oil wells pumping oil for a finite period into money wells pumping money for infinity. Once the money wells were pumping, each year 1/2 of the earnings account's earnings would be dispersed among Alaska residents. The other half of the earnings could be used for essential government services. As noted, UAA history professor emeritus Stephen Haycock said in a 2018 commentary in Tom's Anchorage Daily News, the dividend program is how all Alaskans receive some personal benefit from the development of their natural resources. Would it please the designers that the state legislature has now diverted into state coffers a large portion of what used to be the people's direct benefit? No. Hammond said clearly that the fund's earnings should go into the people's hands, not the legislature's. The PFD puts Alaskans in the same position as lower 48 mineral owners. It puts a share of resource wealth in the hands of the private sector. And it helps curb the resource curse, something that Governor Hammond was very focused on, that has infected other countries dependent on resource wealth, where resource wealth is spent on government projects without building up the private sector, and where, because it isn't their money being spent, citizens do not constrain government. The PFD accomplishes all of those objectives, puts Alaskans in the same place as lower 48 mineral owners, helps to solve the resource curse, and helps engage citizens in helping to curb the growth of government. Thank you.
Is this on now? Yeah, great. Thanks, and congratulations, Brad. No, okay, next, Larry.
Sure, I'll disagree a little bit. I think before the dividend came around, the original purpose of the permanent fund, and then we got the dividends, was so that Alaskans would feel more protective of the permanent fund if they're getting something out of it. So it was to maintain or build and maintain that connection. Absent getting something out of the fund, we could have just pissed it away like they did with the Alberta Heritage Fund the first time. So I think that's an important part of it. Look, I think the dividend is still valid and necessary. I think the annual dividend is an essential part of the household cash for a significant portion of Alaska families. That the dividend is not basic income. You know, it's not a substitute, but for a significant portion of Alaskans, hey, it's not just essential, it's really necessary for the basics of life. As far as what Alaskans have gotten out of their resource wealth, because the state generally does own subsurface rights, I'd say we got 45 years without paying taxes, and that was a hell of a benefit for as long as it continues, in addition to the dividend. So I think we need to continue a dividend at some affordable level. I go longer, but I figure short's good.
Now, I'm, is my mic on? Okay, sorry. Angela, it's your turn. There was no cowbell rang, but anyway, Larry has spoken his piece.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I should just jump in there. So I get to take the position of no PFD. And I think it's really important to recognize how the permanent fund was created and how it has evolved over time. When you look back at the joint report of the House Judiciary and Finance Committees at the time the amendment was adopted, creating the permanent fund, the chairman explained, quote, that the principal would be used for income producing investments, that the legislature could change from time to time to meet the needs of the state. They explained that it was their intent to give future legislatures the maximum flexibility in using permanent fund earnings, ranging from adding principal to paying out a dividend to paying for state services, but that flexibility would remain for future legislatures. And we are in that era now where we need to use that money for other purposes, as Alexi so pointed out with those charts. So that is the position I'm taking, is that there should not be a PFD going forward.
Okay, now we as moderators get to ask you guys a couple follow-up questions, and Tom, why don't you go ahead with that?
Sure. How did you, I guess, how do you arrive at your decision about whether or not permanent fund dividends should maintain at their statutory level, should be somewhere in the middle, or should go away altogether? You know, is that informed by your belief in their necessity for Alaskans, or in your belief that we should follow the law on the books, whatever it is? What's, you know, what I guess is your source of belief in your answer being the correct one?
Well, that's actually the second question to the panel, Tom, but I'll try to take it here. I believe we have a statute in place that we ought to follow the statute until we change the statute. The legislature should respect the law the same as they expect citizens to respect the law until they change it. I also believe that changing the statute to cut the dividend would have a regressive impact on 80% of Alaska families. That would be less than if we use taxes to fill it. And I also think it, as you, referring to Gunnar's 2016 study, I think it would have a large adverse impact on the overall economy. So legislature ought to follow the law the way they expect citizens to follow the law. And we ought to avoid regressive taxation, and we ought to maximize the economy.
A quick question, additional follow-up question for Brad. You said, well, the permanent fund dividend has given Alaskans a stake, you know, in a personal stake in their welfare, quoting Steve Haycock's and so on. What would you say to the Alaskans that who criticize the dividend program and say, well, it looks to me like the PFD, the Permanent Fund Program, has created a situation where we are cutting critical public services in order to pay dividends?
We're cutting critical services because we don't have revenue. There are various ways to raise revenue, some of which have a hugely regressive impact, like using the PFD, and have an adverse impact on the overall economy, like PFD cuts, some of which have a lesser impact on Alaska families, a much lesser impact on Alaska families, and a much lesser impact on the economy. I think the touchstone that we ought to be looking at, or that we ought to be thinking about, is what's the lowest impact revenue source we can have on Alaska families, what's the least adverse impact on the economy we can have, and look at the revenue source as trying to define a revenue source that does that, as opposed to saying, well, we just ought to use PFD cuts.
Okay, thanks very much to all of you. Let's go on to question 2, Tom.
What should be the method for determining the size of the permanent fund dividend? Should there be a formula, or should the legislature decide each year what the PFD amount should be? Should the formula be a percentage of the total draw from the permanent fund, or something else? And if so, what percent? And for this one, we're going to start with Larry.
I think there should be a formula in statute rather than sort of ad hoc every year. But I think looking ahead at limited revenues, the tremendous need out there for public services, I will say, to comment on Brad's comment, cutting public services is just as regressive for, I'd say, most households as slicing their dividend a little bit when you look at schools and childcare and the rest. Anyway, I would advocate, if I were in charge, a formula that was blended between permanent fund earnings and oil revenues. Permanent fund earnings, because of the 5% average percent of market value, relatively stable. Oil revenues are what fluctuates widely and creates the budget crisis in years of low prices, and talks about cutting services and why we can't fund needed programs. So I would say, looking ahead, do a formula that blends permanent fund earnings, oil revenues, so when the state has high oil prices and solid revenues, your dividend's better. When things are tight, we're not just cutting public services.
Thank you, Larry. Brad?
I think we should continue to stick with Governor Hammond's 50-50 approach, which treats the permanent fund dividend as a preferred dividend or a royalty distribution. As Governor Hammond explained, cuts from that level are hugely regressive head taxes, As the 2016 study by the ISA researchers explained, and the 2017 study by ITEP reinforced, using PFD cuts to pay for government has the largest adverse impact on the overall Alaska economy and is by far the costliest approach for middle and lower income 80% of Alaska families of the various revenue alternatives. There are much lower impact and more equitable revenue alternatives. Boiled down to its essence, the issue around the size of the PFD is a simple who pays for government question. Should middle and lower income Alaska families be required to bear the bulk of the burden of by using PFD cuts, or should the burden be spread more broadly to include upper income Alaska families, non-residents, and the oil companies through broad-based taxes? I think that we should stick with the approach that Governor Hammond outlined in the 50-50 approach and use other, if we need additional revenues, use other revenue approaches that have a lower impact and are less regressive.
Thank you, Brad. Angela?
Thank you. The method for the size of the permanent fund needs to be tied to the balance and be balanced between both needs of the state and the PFD. So I believe in a formula that is surplus driven. When we talk about mineral royalties, let's be really clear. 753 million of the overwhelming amounts deposited in investment earnings were royalty related. So there's over $4 billion in investment earnings in 2023. There was 753 million in royalty. If you want a PFD tied to royalty, that is definitely an alternative. But let's be very realistic here. The PFD is being based on an earnings formula that is taking advantage of a global market and how successful the fund has been on a global market basis. So this is not some royalty, personal, well-driven, my share of the natural resource wealth anymore. And it hasn't been for a very long time. So let's make sure that our PFD, if it's going to be calculated on our natural resource wealth, that it goes back to royalty. But I believe that we need a surplus-driven PFD that recognizes that as a community of Alaska, as Alaskans who need education, as Alaskans who need public welfare, as Alaskans who need streets plowed, troopers to show up, that we recognize a balance in all of this. And the PFD needs to be part of that balance. It can't overweight those other services.
Brad, I have a follow-up for you. You advocate stick to the original or the currently existing statute. Don't change it, and that should be the formula. And my question is, what's magic about that number, 50% of basically 50% of recent average earnings? That was a formula that was adopted as appropriate at a time when Alaska's fiscal circumstances were extremely different, when oil revenues were enormous compared to permanent fund earnings. Why is that still the right formula? Why not something different? What's magic about 50%?
I think 50% is magic because it's an equality question. It's an equal split. 50% goes to PFDs, which are most important to middle and lower income Alaska families. The other 50% is used basically to subsidize taxes, to avoid taxes, which are important to the top 20% of Alaska families. And I think what Hammond did was strike a balance between those two uses of the earnings stream to benefit both sides equally. I'm concerned that if we start cutting down on the 50% of the PFD, the 50% that is of most benefit to middle and lower income Alaska families, all we're doing is we're shifting that benefit in terms of tax subsidies to the top 20%. And we're beginning to overweight the benefit going to the top 20% at the expense of the middle and lower income Alaska families. So 50%, I think Hammond was a genius, frankly, in that regard, giving both sides of that equation an equal weight, an equal share. And redoing that balance is going to tilt that balance in favor, frankly, of the top 20% by increasing the subsidies that they're receiving on their taxes.
Um, First, Larry, and then Angela, I'd be curious your response to Brad.
Well, I think we can solve the problem of the top 20% by adopting an income tax that takes care of their pockets. And, you know, when Hammond expounded his theories, did he know we'd have 735,000 people in the state, that oil production would be 25% of what it was at its peak, that we've had buildings at the university were damaged in the 2018 earthquake that haven't been fixed yet. The world changes. Nothing against Jay Hammond, but it's changed, and we need to think for ourselves as to what we can afford and how to pay for it.
Angela?
Yeah, I think when I look at the 50%, there's no recognition of the 50% that legislatures over the years chose to put back into the permanent fund and continue to invest. And all of us who have received PFDs have had the benefit of that reinvestment. Government didn't use its 50% year over year over year. And now they've started using that 50%. And I think we need to recognize just how important the delayed use by government has been and how it's benefited all of us. It has benefited us in the PFDs we've received, and it has benefited us in the support of the services that we've asked government to provide for us. And so we can talk about a 50-50 formula, but that 50-50 formula doesn't take into account all the money that's been earned by the 50% never spent by government.
Thanks. Okay, moving on to question 3. If we have a PFD formula, should it be guaranteed in the Constitution? So assuming there should be a formula, should it be written into statute as it is now, or should we adopt a formula in the Constitution? And I'd like to invite Angela, followed by Larry and Brad, to answer this.
The Constitution is our value system, reflects our value system as a state, as a community of people that live in this state. Article 7 of that Constitution gives us a right to education. It protects public health. It provides for the public welfare. Article 8 of that Constitution, of our Constitution, has a right to natural resources, that the development of those resources are for the maximum use of our communities, for the public interest. And so the PFD, if it were put into the Constitution, would put a monetary value that one could argue would come ahead of all these other rights and all these other things we value as a state. And so no, there should not be a guarantee. It would remove all flexibility. It would diminish all other government services that we all enjoy today and all other rights that we enjoy. And it should not be the #1 right in our Constitution. So no, there should not be a PFD guarantee and formula in our Alaska Constitution.
Larry?
I'll agree on that. You know, to elevate the dividend to up there with public safety and education, I think is irresponsible. It's a self-inflicted ransomware attack. We're putting a virus in our own Constitution. You know, Constitution Section 1, first section, the inherent rights, talks about Constitution's dedicated principles, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all that stuff. But it also says all persons have corresponding obligations to the people and to the state. I think we need to look at that first section of the Constitution, think, are we following it? Putting the dividend in the Constitution, elevating it above everything else, it just ignores, to me, that first section of the Constitution where everyone does have an obligation to the state and to their fellow citizens.
Brad?
Before 2017, I would have said no, we can trust the legislature to follow the law. But given the recent history, yes, the PFD should be put in the Constitution. despite the fact that PFD cuts have the largest adverse impact of all the revenue options on the Alaska economy and are by far the costliest alternative for Alaska families, it's been treated as the easy go-to tax option. The PFD should be treated the same as any other income with any clawbacks accomplished through broad-based taxes. We shouldn't allow the legislature to default to the option that has the largest adverse impact on the Alaska economy and is by far the costliest for middle and lower income Alaska families. I support HJR 7 as a compromise approach. That protects the PFD, but as up here on the slide, it provides that the amount shall be determined by a formula set out in law. I think that compromise accomplishes the objective of constitutionalizing the PFD, but provides the legislature and the governor, who now has no role because of the way the legislature is doing it, provides the legislature and the governor with a role in changing it from time to time if it needs to be changed.
All right, as a follow-up, you've mentioned a few times how the burden of cutting PFD cuts falls hardest on lower and middle income families, and how there are more equitable revenue solutions. We're stepping on future questions a little bit, but what do you see as more equitable that would help balance that $900 million deficit that exists in this year's budget?
Well, I'm an advocate of a flat tax, and the flat tax would take the same amount of income as a percent from all Alaskans and non-residents. The non-residents, currently Alaskans are overpaying for their government by about 10% because they're not recovering a share of the cost of government from non-residents, as happens in every other one of the 49 states. So I think that there is more equitable ways. If you use a flat tax, even if you use a sales tax, as regressive as it is, it will take less from 80% of Alaska families, middle and lower income Alaska families, than PFD cuts are taking as a share of income. So I think a flat tax, but there are other approaches that have equally as beneficial an impact on 80% of Alaska families than PFD cuts.
When you say a flat tax, do you mean a flat income tax?
Yes.
Brad, you talk about, you quote the study which...
You know we have two other panelists, right?
Yeah, but this is a particular point I have to address specifically to you, because you said, you quoted an ICER study, which I directed and wrote in significant part, that concluded that the dividend cuts would have the largest adverse impact on the Alaska economy. That referred, as we made quite specifically clear, to the largest short-term impact on the Alaska economy of the effects of changes in money flows. But we also specifically noted in that study that we didn't look at long-term impacts on the Alaska economy. And so I would ask you to say, how confident are you that if we think about, if sort of we could say a big dividend would be great for the Alaska economy, say this year. Is a big dividend great for the Alaska economy over the next 30 years if it comes at the cost of not funding schools, or not funding roads, or other things that could be done? Or, I mean, that's my question.
I think it's a false choice, Gunnar, because if we need revenue, if we need roads, if we need schools, there are other ways to raise the revenue that have a lower impact, even under your analysis, have a lower impact on the economy. There were two drivers to your conclusion that PFD cuts have the largest adverse impact. One is they take money only out of Alaskans' pockets. They don't take money from non-residents. So we're leaving 10% on the table, or 15%, whatever the number is, on the table by not taking money from non-residents. That doesn't change over the long term. That condition stays the same.
Would you agree, Brad, that PFD cuts do take money from the federal government? That the significant share of dividends that goes straight to the federal government?
Yeah, but Matt Berman has a solution to that, Gunnar, as you well know.
Okay.
Your colleague, Matt Berman, has a solution to that, which is to allow the portion that's going to state taxes to be treated as an energy rebate and isn't then taxed by government.
Okay. I don't want to bog us down in this long-running debate.
We'll move on to question number 4. How should a PFD formula work in years of particularly high or particularly low state revenues? Should a PFD formula include provisions to pay a higher PFD in years when state revenues are particularly high, or a lower PFD in years when state revenues are particularly low? How might these provisions work? And for this one, we will start again with Brad.
Like the preferred dividend that it is, the PFD formula should remain constant as a percent of the relatively stable POMV draw. Variable revenues, the state's problem with variable revenues should be addressed, in my opinion, by stabilizing oil revenue by averaging the amount used for budgeting purposes over time. I've written, if anybody wants to know how this works, I've written a couple of columns for the Alaska Landmine that explains how you would average over time and stabilize oil revenue. That's where the problem is. Stabilizing oil revenue is where the problem is. And if we need additional revenues through additional sources of substitute revenues. The variable problem isn't a problem that the PFDs caused. It isn't a problem that the PFD can solve. The PFD should be left alone and treated as the preferred dividend that it is.
And next, Larry.
Well, if you change the formula to include some factor there of oil revenues, I think that goes a long way toward solving the problem of greatly fluctuating revenues. The PFD is not guaranteed. If the state of Alaska Inc. doesn't have as much revenue this year, everybody, dividends, state employees, road plowing, every piece is going to have to chip in to balance the budget. So I think having a formula that is a hybrid of oil revenues, as Angela pointed out, most of the the royalties is a small portion of the income to the permanent fund. But anyway, a hybrid of oil revenues and permanent fund earnings, I think, is a good compromise. And an affordable compromise, or more affordable. And to Brad's point, plus we need taxes anyhow.
Thanks, Larry. Angela?
I agree with what Larry just said. When we're in a surplus area, absolutely the dividend, the permanent fund dividend be based on as I've mentioned before, a surplus generates a better PFD. And it recognizes its role with all the other services that are being demanded. And quite honestly, that type of formula, a PFD that's based on surplus, is going to put a lot of pressure to keep government spending lower so that there is a surplus, so that we don't spend beyond our means and that we keep spending at a reasonable level. And so I do like the idea of a PFD based on surpluses rather than a PFD, and then in low state revenue years, we all have to give, and it means no PFD in those years.
Angela, could you expound just a little bit more on sort of hypothetically how such a surplus-based PFD formula might work? Well, I mean, what would be a simple example of how it might work? I'm not asking for.
Yeah, so the way, Alaska is a really interesting state anyways, in terms of how it generates its budget, right? It comes at it from a list of, here's everything we want to spend our money on. Now, where do we get the money from? About 30% these days come from oil and gas production tax. About 50% is coming from the PFD. And I probably have these percentages way off. I'm not looking at anything, so I apologize. But you get the sense, and you saw that from Alexi's graphs that I wish he still had up so you could see that impact. But when you think about how it would work, is we don't ever look at revenue surpluses as a way to because we don't have individual taxes here. We don't have an income tax. We don't have a sales tax. So when you look at tax regimes in the lower 48, they use surpluses as a method to rebate back to people so that they only tax, in theory, this is theoretical, in theory, what you're going to spend on. Well, because we don't tax, we don't have the same ability to do that rebate. So you know what we have the ability to do? We have the ability to write a PFD at that point. And I think that is a very helpful solution to those who really want to be fiscally thoughtful about where we're spending our money, how much we're spending on services, the priorities of those services. And when we think about growing our economy in this state and creating jobs and drawing people to this state, people want to know that their kids have schools to go to, that they can buy a home, that they can open a business, that they can conduct their life the way they want. And the idea that we provide a stable set of services goes a long way towards that, towards drawing those people here to Alaska. And that's what Alaska was founded on this amazing growth opportunity. And I want to see the state get back to that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Angela. That's quite helpful.
And I did hear the cowbell.
Question 5. Can and should we have both, at the same time, both a PFD as well as broad-based taxes, such as an income tax or a sales tax or Brad's proposed flat tax? Now, some Alaskans argue that it's reasonable and fair to pay Alaskans PFDs while also having them support state government by paying broad-based taxes. Other Alaskans argue that it's unreasonable and unfair to tax Alaskans while continuing to pay out money as dividends. And so my question for the panelists is, can and should we have both? And I'd like to invite Larry to go first.
I think we need both, and you can have both. Sure, it's a little goofy. You're going to have to explain it to in-laws, friends, family in the lower 48. Well, we hand out money and then we tax. But as Brad pointed out, they are, how would I put this? The not paying a $3,500 dividend as the governor wants. Yes, it hurts people of limited income more than it hurts rich people. An income tax, if you structure it, would take more from the wealthy. I think you need both because we do need additional revenues in order to keep an affordable PFD and meet the deferred maintenance and the service needs, the public services that the state needs, the public needs, so that we can get back into a growth mode. So yeah, it's a little strange. We do things strangely here. I think you need both, and it balances out the winners and losers by having both. And as Brad points out, also with income tax, you're finally starting to recover something from the people who work here but don't live here and enjoy the services. Let them pay too.
I'm going to pick up on something Larry said in the last question to start to answer this question. He said every piece should chip in to balance the budget. And then in an earlier answer, he said we all have corresponding obligations. Well, the top 20% don't chip in much. They don't chip in as much as the remaining 80% of Alaska families under the system we have. Non-residents don't chip in anything toward the cost of government, even though they benefit from the cost of government. If we need revenue, we should raise them through broad-based taxes. What Lyman Hoffman said on the Senate floor in 2021 is if the dividend, whatever that amount is placed into an operating budget, and what is spent on government is placed into that budget, the first call, what I call the preferred dividend, is for the dividend. The ad hoc draw is for government, to fund government. If we are going to have to tax people, it's not taxing people to give them a bigger dividend check because they receive the first call. It's taxing people to the level of government we are voting on in this budget. As the 2016 report from the ISA researchers made clear, using PFD cuts to fund government has the largest adverse impact on both the Alaska economy and middle and lower income Alaska families. Using broad-based taxes both has lower adverse impact on the economy and is much more equitable to Alaska families. In particular, by raising a portion of the revenue from non-residents, it will reduce the burden on the Alaska economy. The 2016 report by the ISO researchers found that a broad-based tax would raise roughly 10% of the revenue from non-residents. Put another way, Alaskans are overpaying the government by 10% by not using a broad-based approach. We're shooting ourselves and the Alaska economy in the foot. I do believe we should continue to pay the PFD. I don't think that's connected to revenues. I do think we ought to be raising revenues to pay for government services on a broad-based, equitable, and low impact to the economy basis.
Thanks, Brad. Angela?
Sure. Can we have a PFD and broad-based taxes? Yes. Should we? I don't know. I think the question needs to be bifurcated, quite honestly. We have to have a much more serious conversation about the PFD itself and broad-based taxes. I think Brad did a really good job of highlighting the need for broad-based taxes, paying for those government services, attaching that spending to it. I don't believe in the PFD being the top line, but rather the bottom line, going back to the origination of the permanent fund itself and the idea that it was going to be what would take care of our community once oil and gas was no longer available to do that. And we have to really consider the PFD as this, if it's the safety net, we can do a lot of really good things for middle and lower class families, and we can provide a lot better schools. We can provide better services on a much more efficient economic basis if we take this PFD fight off the table.
Thanks, Angela. Brad, you've mentioned that basically you feel like the wealthiest 20% of Alaskans are kind of taking a free ride by, getting basically if the PFD is cut, it hurts people below them much more than it hurts them because they have plenty of income. Given that, why not structure the PFD differently so that they get less and lower income folks get more, or make your tax more progressive so that they pay more in the income tax than the folks at lower income brackets?
I wrote an article once on why we don't means test the PFD. The problem with that, Tom, is I think once we start down that slope, I think it's a very slippery slope. And what we have in each budget cycle is, oh, well, the PFDs become welfare. We've now made it means-tested welfare. And, we really don't like welfare, so we're going to cut it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And I think that's just another way to the end of the PFD. I think the concept that Hammond had that every Alaskan should have a share of the resource wealth, an equal, just like a royalty trust in the lower 48, an equal share of the resource wealth, and then we're going to raise our revenues another way. I think that concept has a lot more merit to it, a lot more robustness to it, a lot more durability to it than starting to means test the PFD and starting to squeeze it down to zero.
We'll move on to question 6 in hopes that we can get some time for some Q&A here. Is your vision for the future of the PFD politically feasible? Would enough Alaskans and legislators support it so that it could actually happen? And for this one, we'll start with Angela.
I find it fantastic that we're even having this conversation, because when I started coming to Alaska in 1996 and moved here in 2011, this is a conversation that would not have happened. And it's really important that this conversation be happening. Do I believe my vision for the future of the PFD is feasible? I do believe it's feasible. We have come to the realization that we can't do it all. And we either have to get very comfortable with broad-based taxes, and we have to get comfortable with a changing size of the PFD, potentially zero PFD. And we have to come to an understanding of what we really want in terms of government services. So is it feasible? Yes. Is it feasible this year? Probably not. But we continue to talk about it, continue to work on a collective vision for Alaska, it does become very feasible.
Thank you, Angela. Larry?
I'll agree, not this year. I think you need the right political leadership to bring the discussion up to even a higher level. What's an affordable PFD? How do you impose a tax? What services should what services should the state provide, and is the public willing to pay for? But we need political leaders who will look at it as a how would I want to say this? We need elected officials who will look at the dividend not as a campaign issue, but as something that's really important for the future of Alaska and what services, what kind of state we become, instead of just a cheap campaign pledge.
And Brad?
I think the legislature's 2021 Fiscal Policy Working Group outlined a format to get us to a solution. It said it has to be a little bit of everything. That working group proposed a 50-50, POMV 50-50 PFD as opposed to the current statutory PFD. It also proposed some other sources of revenue. It also proposed some oil tax, some increased oil taxes. And I think that sort of balanced approach where everybody gives a little bit, including the top 20% as a result of a tax, and non-residents as a result of a tax, I think that balanced approach has a saleability. We've seen sort of a come to Jesus moment for Ben Carpenter, who was a member of the Fiscal Policy Working Group, who recognized that there needed to be a balanced approach. And Ben Carpenter, one of the most conservative legislators, has proposed a sales tax, a broad-based sales tax that would hit the top 20%, would hit non-residents as part of a comprehensive plan, as part of a balanced plan. And I think there is support that we can build in the legislature for that sort of approach. I would note that when in this current budget cycle, when Sarah Hannon, Representative Hannon from Juneau, proposed an amendment to cut the PFD this budget cycle to 25.75, it failed on the House floor by 11 yes, 29 no. And I think that's an indicator that people understand that we need a PFD and we need to be fair to middle and lower income Alaska families and have a low impact on the overall Alaska economy. So yes, I think we can come to a solution.
Thanks, Brad. Before I throw to Gunnar for questions, just so people here are apprised of developing events, kind of fitting that we've had this discussion tonight because I've received 2 ADN alerts since being here. The first was that the Alaska House has passed an operating budget with a $2,273 dividend and extra school funding. The second one is that a proposal to enshrine the permanent fund dividend in the Constitution has failed to clear the House.
Okay, so this is a follow-up question really for all of you. You know, to me, intellectually, for a long time, just personally where I'm sitting from, it seems eminently fair, Hammond's original idea of we'll share this wealth equally with all Alaskans, and then we'll tax Alaskans to, you know, to help pay for the services that they receive and expect from government. But what I've observed over the years is a very large number of Alaskans who say, under no circumstances, cut our dividends. And I've also observed a very large share of Alaskans and legislators who say, we do not want to pay taxes, and particularly don't want to pay taxes if we're also handing out dividends. And I don't see these getting resolved. What I don't see being proposed or advocated or supported by anybody is saying, let's have both. And so although it sounds very appealing in theory, in reality, what I see is that this impasse that we're in results in things that I particularly value and think are important, like having our roads plowed and, you know, having a decent number of, you know, kids in a class in school gets sacrificed so that we can, so that these two groups can both have their way, not have taxes and get dividends. And so it sounds great, but how do you actually get there? So I'd appreciate if all of you can suggest how you actually get there if that's where we should get to.
I'll go first. There is a group that has said exactly that. The Fiscal Policy Working Group.
Right.
In 2021 said exactly that. And their members have moved forward with pieces of that. Ben's moved forward with the constitutional amendment, which failed 22 to 18, I guess the number is. Didn't get to 27, but it got a majority. He's moved forward with the sales tax at the same time as he's moved forward with constitutionalizing the PFD. He's moved forward with a PFD cut to 50-50. One of the bills that Jesse Sumner tried to throw on the floor today was a bill from the Senate that would cut the PFD as modified by House Ways and Means to POMV 50-50. So politicians are talking about this, Gunnar. I don't think it's fair to say that nobody's talking about trying to get to a resolution. The Fiscal Policy Working Group did. There are members who are trying to move forward with pieces of that, and I think we ought to support them.
Larry, Angela, or Larry and then Angela?
Yeah, I think like Angela said earlier, we're talking about more than we used to. We're talking about it more sincerely than we used to. And eventually, I hope that Alaskans and their elected officials will settle on something that, as Brad mentioned, it's all the above, right? It's going to take time to get people comfortable enough. It's going to take time for the public to give the permission slip to their elected officials that it's okay to do this, not just talk about it, but do it and not get voted out of office. Well, truthfully, a few will get voted out of office anyhow. That's just the price you pay for doing the right thing. So we're talking, we're going to get there. I think it's going to take a few more years, and it may take a crisis to do it. It may take a year where there's just not enough money because of oil prices, market crashes, whatever. You look at it and you say, I can't afford what I want. It's crisis time, and we got to get real. You get a few more votes, and you actually put together a majority and get something done.
I would just add to what Larry said is that it takes real leadership. And it's not just in the legislature, it's in the executive branch as well. And it has to be a willingness of all parts of government to come together and to really work authentically towards a solution. And speak to, if you propose a statewide tax, pursue that statewide tax, pursue the PFD, pursue a PFD formula, have the conversations in committees, have the conversation at the table, have the town halls across the state. This is so important to Alaskans across the state. This is a topic that unites us all in so many different ways. And so we have to have a collective conversation. We have to listen to each other about what's important across the state as well. And so once that is happening, and it has been happening, but it's going to take collective leadership in our communities and across branches of government to make something like this happen and for things to change.
Just briefly, before we move on to questions from the audience here, could you each give your best wild guess as to when this debate will be resolved? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, not in our lifetimes? We'll start with Angela.
This debate will be resolved in 2028 to 2030 timeframe.
Larry?
Yeah, I'd say we've got to go through another gubernatorial election cycle, couple of legislative cycles. So 2028 if things go well. And again, that also depends on the outside factors of oil prices, market returns, permanent fund earnings. That could precipitate a little bit earlier or a little bit later.
And Brad?
When Governor Dunleavy follows through on the statement he made last spring that we ought to have sales taxes. When he finally puts that on the floor and he gets behind it, we'll get this resolved.
Think you will?
It depends on what Americans for Prosperity Alaska and the Alaska Policy Forum do. That's why he didn't follow through on it last time. If he can overcome them and get the guts up to do it, we'll get this resolved.
First of all, we're now moving towards the final part of our program where we can take sort of general questions from the audience, as well as additional follow-up questions that the panelists might have for each other and that we might have for you and so on. So I want to invite any of you that are here or that are listening online, if you have questions, if you're online, please put them in the chat box or text them in or whatever you're supposed to do to submit the questions. And if you're here, just hand them up to Chuck and he'll pass them on to me. I want to start with a question from somebody in our audience here who is saying, how many of our state elected representatives campaigned on promising to fight for a full PFD, but now that they're in office, they say that our state finances are too bad, and so they can't, they're not following through. And so this person says, what can we, the people, do to put the PFD in the Constitution? I guess the more way I'd maybe possibly rephrase or add to the question is a lot of Alaskans are frustrated that they voted for people who promised a full PFD and they're not getting it, and some of them seem to be backing down on that. What would be your responses? I'll invite Larry to go first, then Angela, then Brad.
I think that those legislators would fall into two categories. Those who, out of ignorance, said you can afford a $3,500 PFD, not realizing the money is not there. And they got smarter when they actually did some homework and realized can't do it. I think there's another group who basically just lied to get elected because they knew they'd never have to make good on it and it was a good pledge.
I'm going to be a little bit softer than Larry on that one.
Thank you.
I do think that we run for office believing we can carry through on promises like a full PFD without a full appreciation of what that means. And when you get in front of the budget debates and you start to see what the cuts look like and what needs to happen on that front, or what your tax position that maybe you also pledged no taxes, what that can mean, it gets very hard very, very fast. And it's really important as voters that we push on those running for office and that we understand what the trade-offs are for our elected officials.
Oh, sorry, Brad.
The question was, how many legislators fall in that category? Too many fall in that category. I mean, more than gets us to a resolution. What is most frustrating to me are and I know one very well, are candidates who at the same time say, I'm going to give you a full PFD and I'm not going to have taxes. That person's not realistic. That person doesn't understand the amount of spending that we've embedded in this government and doesn't understand what it's going to take. That's impossible. So we're going to get there when candidates understand that the question is not whether we're going to have taxes. PFD cuts are taxes. The question is, what kind of taxes are we going to have? Are they going to be equitable or not? Are they going to be low impact to the economy or not? When we have candidates who understand that, we're going to make some progress.
Just to follow up just a little bit on that, do you feel like those, the candidates who promise both, Brad, do you feel like they are being ignorant or cynical or some mix of the two?
Disingenuous. I mean, they're saying what it takes, what they think it takes to get elected. They're trying to appeal to two different groups at the same time. And you know, that worked to get them elected, but it's not working to have government. So if we're going to have a functional government, we need to have people who are realistic about what it's going to take to get us government.
We have a question here from a woman who's has asked if Brad could comment on basically trends in government spending in recent years, and she's got a chart on her iPhone that she's hoping you can address. But I don't want to. If it takes us too far afield, then let's not do it.
Here's the problem with government spending. The problem with government spending is we don't have all Alaskans pushing back on government spending. We have 80% of Alaska families who are being adversely impacted by that government spending in terms of PFD cuts. The top 20% don't feel it. Non-residents don't feel it at all. The oil companies don't feel it, basically, because they're not paying any of the incremental, as government spending goes up, they're not paying any incremental costs in terms of increased taxes on them. It's all being shoved to 80% of Alaska families. If we had everybody in this game, if we had all Alaskans paying equitably toward the cost of government, if we had the oil companies contributing, Hillcorp having to give up its $100 million golden exemption because of the way it's formed its corporation, if we had non-residents and the industries that hire the non-residents, the tourism industry, the fishing industry, if we had them in the game pushing back on spending, we would have a different discussion going on in Juneau. We would have people saying, I don't know if I want to pay taxes. Everybody in the legislature is in the top 20%. After the pay raise they gave themselves, they're all in the top 20% now. They're saying what they're saying is, I don't have to pay this. Fine, yeah, increase it on me or increase it on the other 80%. I don't have to pay it. If they had to pay it, if the non-resident industries had to pay it, if the oil companies had to pay it, we would have a different spending structure than we've got right now. So, yes, spending's gone up, but the way to solve that is not to have spending caps or anything else that people can find workarounds. The way to solve it is to have everybody in the game pushing back on it, and that takes a broad-based tax.
Yeah. Thanks. Here's a question that gets at another issue that you hear from time to time in discussions of the Permanent Fund. Somebody says, hypothetically, imagine that the Permanent Fund grew to $500 billion, okay? So and this would, under a 50% POMV formula, I don't know if the dividends, if the calculation is exactly correct, this would be a dividend of more than $21,000 per Alaskan. Do we want all American families to look to Alaskan PFDs as the new reason to move north? I'd invite, why don't we start with Angela and Larry, Brad?
We talk about the dividend in that format, and I look at all the families leaving Alaska now, and we have some of the best dividends that have been paid in history the last few years. And people are leaving because it's not enough. It's not enough to create jobs. It's not enough to get a good education. We're not creating a future in this state for our kids. We're not doing it. And the PFD is not doing it. Broad-based tax won't do it. We have to create a future for this state. And what disappoints me in all the conversations that happen right now is there's no vision of the future for the state at all. And $21,000 PFDs, families moving up here, there are people that have said they have moved here for a PFD. There are people who have left because they couldn't support their families here. And I want a state that creates jobs, that supports families, that has a future. That's what I hope for.
Larry?
Well, last time I looked, the projection was if things go well, the permanent fund might hit 100 billion by 2030, 2031. So I don't know, 500 billion is a little hypothetical. Like I say, well, hypothetical before then we could go bankrupt if we don't figure out our fiscal structure. So, but I'm with Angela. There's more to living in Alaska than getting the PFD. It's got to be an attractive place to live, to grow up, to educate your children.
I will say I don't like to answer hypothetical questions, and this one's a hypothetical built on top of a hypothetical built on top of a hypothetical. I will say this, though, in response to Angela's statement. When you look at who's not coming to Alaska, when you look at where the population drop is, and I've done this on the basis of IRS data, which enables you to segment it like that, it's middle and lower income Alaska families that are not coming to Alaska. It's the ones we're taxing that aren't coming to Alaska. The top 20% is growing in the state. The numbers in the top 20% are growing. It's the middle and lower income Alaska families that are dropping, the number of those households that are dropping. So, you know, if you tax something, it goes away. We've dropped a tax on middle and lower income Alaska families, and they're going away.
Brad, can I follow up with a question on what you just said? Is how much of that is demographics as well? So the last numbers I saw is that the bulk of those moving out are 25 to 50-year-olds, which are going to, especially on the younger side, are going to fall into those lower middle income brackets, and that those are staying are the older Alaskans, older than 50, and that's going to naturally fall into a higher income bracket because they've had their careers, they've made their wealth. So I would just like to hear from you if you have any information that you can share on the demographics of the age groups and that fall into those categories. That would be helpful.
So IRS data breaks it down on, I think it's age 60, maybe age 60, and allows you to see who by income bracket is leaving below age 60, and the converse, who by income bracket is staying above 60. And those who are below 60, by the way, I take offense at that because they call those above 60 elderly. But those below 60, you can see the top 20% in those below 60 staying, and those in the remaining 80% in the below 60 category leaving, or not replenishing themselves. People not moving up here in that category. So it's true both of the elderly, according to the IRS classification, and it's true of the non-elderly, those in below 60.
It seems to me that to a certain extent, from Brad and at least Larry, and we've heard the argument basically, yes, we should have a PFD, and if you think that we shouldn't have a PFD because we need money for services, the solution to that is to impose taxes so people pay their fair share, and including the non-residents who aren't paying anything. And I'm sort of simplifying that. So it becomes an argument we need, the solution to our fiscal problems is taxation, raise the money in taxes, don't cut PFDs. But here we have a person in the audience who's asked the question, at $80 per barrel, we should have enough revenue to fund our government. Sounds like whining from our income tax advocates. What is the magic dollar amount at all? If you take all the PFD and tax us, won't you still whine for more of our incomes? Where is the limit? So the way I'm interpreting it is, at least some people here feel that are not, put it this way, are not in favor of your idea of taxes as our way to solve our problem. And so if that is a strong feeling among many Alaskans, how does that get us to your solution?
Well, there's two answers to that. One is, it'd be great if somebody else, if taxes on somebody else like the oil companies would magically solve this problem. But $80 when you had 1 million barrels a day or 2 million barrels a day is an entirely different revenue stream than when you have 450,000 barrels a day, which is what we have now. So it's unrealistic to think we can tax the oil companies enough to magically close this solution. The second thing is we do have taxes. That's what PFD cuts are. Matt Berman, Gunnar's colleague at ICER, calls taxes the largest, or calls PFD cuts the absolutely
But Brad,
taxes.
my point is, this person's saying, Why in the hell are you advocating for income taxes? Government has more than enough money.
But government doesn't have more than enough money. The realism is we've built a spending structure that is at the size it's going to be, and we're not going to get it under control until we have all Alaskans pushing back, and the non-resident industries and the oil companies pushing back on that size. It is what it is, and we've got to face that reality. Yes, if we could make it disappear overnight, sure, that'd solve the problem, but that's not what's going to happen. And so we've got to be realistic on where the revenues are going to come from to pay for it.
Larry?
With an $80 oil, $80 a barrel oil, and as Brad says, 460,000 barrels a day. Yeah, you can afford government services and a dividend of around 1,200, 1,300, 1,400, somewhere in there. You want a bigger dividend, cut services or taxes. And that's at $80 oil. So yeah, you can afford it. It's just what's your definition of a reasonable dividend? What's your definition of services?
Angela?
Agreed. The debate on spending is, what do you want to give up? What don't you want anymore? And if you don't want certain things, let people know, and there'll be more money for a PFD. It's just math. It's just math. And given the demands of what everybody seems to want their government to deliver in this state, the revenue has to match it. We are required by the Constitution to pass a balanced budget. So, yeah, that's it. And I don't know, I haven't seen in a while, and Brad, you may have the answer to this for people, but it's not, how much would your flat tax generate in terms of revenue to the state? Depends on the rate, right? And sort of the assumption, but.
Alexi has that answer. In the summation of the summary of the governor's proposal, he said a 3% flat tax on adjusted gross income raises $1 billion. So it's not that big a deal. I mean, it's not that big a tax.
Okay, everybody did really well at the 2-minute limit, but now we're at 7:33 or so. So I think we need to wrap it up. So thanks very much. We didn't get to all the questions. We got to most of them, I think. So hopefully we got people's questions answered. Got some really good information. So I really want to thank our excellent panelists giving their time, their thought, their expertise to this subject, and it's been really helpful. So I hope everybody learned something. And I want to thank the moderators, Gunnar and Tom, for doing a great job moderating, asking probing questions, not letting anybody off the hook. And I want to thank our Common Ground staff, Lika, who was on the computer getting comments online, and Danielle was working it, and Jess is our coordinator. She did great, and Hannah was here too. So thanks very much to make this happen. So thanks for coming. For those of us who drove here, drive safely. For those of us who are online, click off easily. Thank you. Good night.